was trying to get over in my presentation about paediatric acquired brain injuries is that it's a common condition. It can have many different causes, but it can produce a fairly common and predictable sets of problems for the children, which will change a little bit in terms of the balance of problem according to whether the child had a severe severe injury or a milder injury. But even children who have milder injuries can have cognitive, language and behavioural and emotional issues that may in fact not present in early childhood but may present later in young adult life. So a service for children with acquired brain injury needs to comprise early assessment, intensive intervention at an early stage, particularly obviously in the severe cases, but also needs to embody the concept of ongoing monitoring and the ability to re-access specialist services later in the clinical course because problems may emerge later. Now, historically, paediatric neurorehabilitation has very much been a Cinderella specialty, and in fact it hasn't really been recognised as a separate specialty in England. That is changing. NHS Specialist Commissioning now recognise paediatric neurorehabilitation as a service that they should have a service specification for. And we are in the process of trying to get agreement not only on the wording of service specification but also on the funding for that. And what we're trying to embed into the service specification is those concepts of the ability to access intensive inpatient neurorehabilitation immediately after the acquired brain injury, and then the concept of perhaps outreach services supporting the child so that they can go home as soon as possible, and outreach services that are there to liaise with the community disability teams so that ongoing monitoring can be provided and the child can be re-referred to the service if necessary. And it will be a difficult thing to take forward because it is inevitably going to cost more money than is being spent on these services at the moment. But I think NHS England understands the problem and is now committed to trying to solve it.
I think going through the things that, I did in the discussion, the biggest challenges are to sell the idea that people with fairly difficult behaviours can live normal lives and participate in a community-based setting. So it's quite difficult to convince people that that's possible, and not only possible, but the right thing to do. Then the next big challenge is to get the right people working to provide that service. So and then maintaining those people and maintaining them to work in the right way. So I think those are probably the biggest challenges. A capable environment was a phrase we coined to describe supporting people in different ways, which was the doing with, not doing to or doing for. Building a therapeutic relationship and understanding that the relationship between the person receiving a service and the person delivering it is the single most important factor. So that's part of a capable environment, and it's one that meets the needs of an individual that's flexible. Many services are not flexible, they're quite rigid.
I think originally the SHIPS project was started because Peter Sharples and Helen Miller, who were running the KISS project, were finding that a lot of children were coming back into the clinics who were not succeeding at all well in the classroom. At the time I was working in the hospital as a ward teacher with children with a brain injury, but I was also doing my masters, and so I was thinking about how children learn, and of course I was absolutely fascinated. When I finished my masters, I looked at moving on to doing a PhD, talking to Helen and Peter about it. Helen was also looking at how children's language developed after a brain injury. So it was a really good way of chatting with people. We also decided that I was better off the kind of teaching I do and what I could offer to people was better working with children who, when they'd left hospital, and get them back into school. And I started to see all the problems that these children have, which are tremendously subtle. And they don't usually provoke help, and that's the problem. What do you do for them? It's not obvious. They're walking, they're talking, they look like everybody else. Particularly grandparents, sometimes fathers, certainly teachers, would say, he's better now. Why are we treating him any differently? He's got to learn to behave. or he's got to learn to get on with it. But there are a lot of psychological problems, there are a lot of language problems, there are a lot of planning issues which occupational therapists would deal with. So, but all of these sort of what we call medical problems under psychologists and OTs and speech therapists and neurologists all come together in the classroom and they affect the life of the child. How do we do this? Now that there's this idea about rehabilitation in the classroom, which is all very good, but you can't expect the classroom to change for just one child. The major problems come in the what we would call Key Stage 3, years 7 to 9. Because by the time they get to year 10, they can drop some subjects. In those sort of Key Stage 3, they need all those planning and executive functions, which are usually affected and have not been noticed in the primary school because they're not needed in the primary school. So suddenly the child is growing up, hormones are kicking in, they're trying to establish an identity. They can't use these skills because they're not there. And there's a whole crisis of, who am I? Why can't I do it? Why am I not like everybody else? Then again, their language skills are messed up. So the way that teenagers speak is fast, it's furious, it's got their own language, and they don't keep up with that. So they lose their friends as well. So put together your academic problems, your social problems, and just self-esteem, and you've got a bit of a recipe for disaster. And so the main problem is between those ages of 11 and 14.
My particular talk was on issues in capacity or of capacity for children. And I really wanted to talk about two things. First of all, the developing law on crime, although that doesn't apply specifically to children. There are some nuances in the law which are specific to children, but the law as it currently stands applies across all those who might find themselves in the criminal justice system. And it's antiquated, it's Dickensian, literally. The law, the rules that relate to the defences of incapacity and whether you're fit to plead go back to the beginning of the 18th century and haven't changed since, but may be about to change. So I wanted to address that, and particularly because those changes may draw on the experiences of the Mental Capacity Act, which is legislation more familiar to those in the audience today who deal with brain-injured children in particular. And the second part of my talk was about my experiences of working with the rather more recent Children and Families Act of 2014 and how that's being put into effect, and in particular the interaction between local authorities and those who lack capacity, and how that, to my mind, is being operated, particularly in this instance, incorrectly.
So I'm a clinical psychologist, so what I'm interested in is how people's well-being and emotional health is impacted upon both by the disability but also by the legal context and by the systemic context of moving between child and adult services. Because I work with people across the lifespan, what I'll often see is much later on than a transition, if it was done badly, it will be very stuck with the person. And if it's gone well, people can move on really, really well. I think it's a time of great loss for people, but it's also a time of huge progress for people. And often what I'll find is if we provide people with the right building blocks, it is not their disability that holds them back. It is their self-esteem or feelings of, or people worrying about risks for them. It's not about them. So building children's confidence is hugely important in terms of how they make that transition.
My son Theo is 11 now. He's just turned 11, and he had meningitis when he was 4 months old. So he's my second child, and so I think I'm here today because we've been through most of the process so far. We've been down the long road with him. We went through all the trauma of him having meningitis and being in special care and coming out of hospital at the other end and sort of being left to deal with everything that had happened to the family. And pick up the pieces, really, I suppose. One of the first things we did in hospital was, obviously, you get on the internet and you Google meningitis, and we came across the Meningitis Research Foundation, and we came across the Meningitis Trust as well. And we've had help from both organisations, but really I've stuck with the Research Foundation because I've been to university and quite used to the sort of medical side of things and talking. I've been quite useful to come and do events like this because I'm not worried about talking in public. And I'm used to giving presentations and things like that. So I think as a parent that seemed to be my thing that I could contribute, really.